that, but we're going to start that in just a few seconds, Brad.
Young lady, the only reason she answered the door was she thought that we were the pizza delivery people. Obviously we weren't, but here we are 10 years later, and we love her like a daughter. Oftentimes when we go to someone's door uninvited, they really don't have interest. And at that point in time, they don't even have interest in the Lord. But if we plant the seed and we begin the relationship, sometime in their life, it may be after the birth of a baby, it may be after a funeral, it may be after an emergency room visit, or something of that nature. They may wake up one day and say, I want to know more about God. I want to go to church. And here's the big question. Where are they going to go? Have you planted that seed? Has your church, your congregation gone out into the community and served them? Have you invited them so that when they say, I want to attend church this Sunday, they think of you? People cannot visit a church they do not know exists. It's important that we plant that seed. I think about when my son was 15 years old. He knocked on a door, he invited the lady to an event we were having, and then he asked, would you like to study the Bible? She motioned back to her coffee table that had an open Bible on it, and she said, you know, I've been studying the Bible for 2 weeks now. I've been reading in a book called John. And she said, I don't understand anything I'm reading. I've been praying now for several days that God would send me someone to help me understand the Bible. So yes, I'll study the Bible with you because I'm assuming you're the answer to the prayers that I've been praying. Isn't it amazing how in your city, there's someone right now searching for the Lord? The question is, can we find them so ultimately they can find the Lord? Any day door knocking is a great day because it gives us the opportunity to help someone find their Lord.
Several years ago, my wife and I were part of a door knocking campaign where at one particular house, a mother and daughter came to the door. Upon hearing our invitation to study the Bible together, the mother responded in shock and amazement as she pointed to a room in the house where she and her daughter had just been reading Acts chapter 10 and praying that God would send someone their way to help them understand the Bible, similar to how God used Peter to teach the gospel to Cornelius and his household. It may very well be that some lost soul in your community is currently searching and praying for help. And it may be that God wants to providentially use you to answer their sincere petition for assistance in understanding and embracing the gospel of Jesus Christ. There also may be individuals in your community who are not seemingly searching at this very moment, but who might eventually be open to a Bible study. Friends, as we approach the annual Brotherhood-wide Door Knocking Day this October, might I offer 3 practical suggestions? First, if you door knock in areas where you've mailed house to house, perhaps hold up a copy and say, we've subscribed to this magazine for you for free. We wanted to hand deliver a copy to see what you think about it. The person at the door may realize they already have some familiarity with you and be less guarded and more willing to talk. Another approach to help people lower their guard might be to ask if you could pray for them. Make a note of their request so that you can follow up with cards, visits, or texts, and pray for them there at the door. This may accomplish a lot of good in the moment and can also lead people to open up about their spiritual needs, whether at that moment or sometime in the future. Finally, people in our communities are hurting, and who better to help than local churches of Christ? Showing people how much we care may soften the ground to teach them about Jesus. You might consider taking a benevolence form such as this one to neighbors around your building to see if they need any assistance. Those in your community might be more open to a Bible study with Christians who care enough to help. Brothers and sisters, may God richly bless you as you let your light shine, as you lovingly engage with your local communities, and as you teach the most precious and important message in the history of the world, the saving gospel of Jesus Christ.
I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Hope everybody's doing well today. Several years ago, I was, after church, had lunch and had just settled down for an afternoon little nap, and a knock on the door took place. And it was, I got there, and it was a fella that was actually looking for my next door neighbor. But he was a minister with a watermelon on his shoulder. And he found out that he had the wrong house. He was looking next door. But he did not fail to take an opportunity, and I've never forgotten that. He immediately said, "Would you like a watermelon?" And I politely told him we had some. And he invited me to church, wanted to know where I went to church. But the point that was not lost on me is here was a fellow that I didn't know that used a mistake, an opportunity that he saw, to open the door. So I think that's a good message that, we do. We don't have to have a watermelon to do that. So if you remember last week, we discussed in our lesson, in our study about the Hebrew Bible, about interpretation and how to read Hebrew or Old Testament poetry. There's a lot of stuff that we did not get a chance to cover. But I've got this week and two more, I believe, in order to wrap this up. So we're going to move on. But if you don't remember anything else from what we talked about, when you read poetry in the Bible, remember that somebody took a great deal of time and effort to write that it was not something that was just thrown together. There was an intent, that there was a purpose there, and it was, in most cases, to give glory to God and demonstrate the power of God And how can we relate to that? That's the main, put it in your pocket and take it away point that we want to remember as we move on. So this morning we're going to talk about reading and interpreting narrative in the Hebrew Bible, again, the Old Testament. And those of you that have not been in the class, we've spent a lot of time in putting together how the Bible, over a period of several thousands of years, came to be compiled and what the purpose of it was. And I keep coming back to this point because I think that it's so important, and it's a point that I think is lost on many people as we try to read biblical narratives, biblical stories, biblical events, historical aspects of the Old Testament. And it was lost on most of the people in Jesus' time. They had come through history without a clear understanding of what the point of the Old Testament was. It had become a tradition to them. It was something that they had taken pride in, but failed to realize the big picture and the point. And I don't want us to do that as we try to wrap this up and conclude. What was the point of the Old Testament? Do you remember? We've discussed this several times. Do you remember where we come back to? What book, chapter are we looking at?
Wasn't it supposed to be kind of a tutor to bring us forward to the New Testament?
It was, in a sense.
Or guide to bring us?
But I think that's a little, Rachel, tends to be a little confusing to people. A tutor or instructions, I think that's probably a more accurate word. But Jesus himself, if you go back to Luke chapter 24, explains it 2 times. Do you remember talking about that? Those who did or have not been here, they didn't understand it. On the road to Emmaus, Jesus took time to take when he was not recognized and explained what his purpose was. He said, don't you know that the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures, that's what they had. The prophets, the law, or Moses, and the Psalms all pointed to him. He repeated that to his apostles after he gathered with them in the room after his resurrection. They were confused. And he said, don't you remember the things that we talked about? That it was pointed out. And even the angels in the tomb told the people exactly the same thing. That Jesus, when he was with you in Galilee, told you that it was necessary that he be betrayed, arrested, killed, and would rise again on the 3rd day. And Jesus explains that a little bit more when he's talking to them. He says, so that my word might be taught and fulfilled in, even at this point, all nations. There was a plan. There was a plan for you and for me, beginning in Jerusalem, which we find carried out in Acts. So as you read this stuff in the Old Testament, we need to remember that there was a purpose when all of these, as we talked about the mosaics of the Old Testament, the different layers, the different composition, the different quilt that was part of the Old Testament comes to pass, that there was a purpose there. And we need to read that with that type of understanding, that it's more than just stories. It's more than just ethical aspects of things that make us better people, that there was a purpose of that. So let's remember that as we continue on. All right, a definition here. When I say narrative, what do I mean? We don't want to assume anything. Joan, you're fixing to tell us. A story, okay? And that's basically it. Stories can take different aspects, can't they? And we all have people that we read. We, including myself, will tell a story sometime. Sometimes it likes to be embellished. Sometimes it takes different directions on things, but it's still a story. It's a narrative that we explain things. And the Old Testament is more than just a historical representation of the children of Israel. And sometimes that's what we think of. We even have, those little books, and they're subtitled History. Do you remember that? But the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, is much more than just a historical aspect of what we want to remember. So I hope that you got one of the printouts. Did you get a printout? There's quite a few pages front back here, so there's more than one lesson. We're going to have to kind of speed things up if we can to get that. So maybe you got one, and we're going to briefly go over that. The point that we want to bring out from any kind of a narrative, and we've briefly talked about this before, that what does that narrative represent? When somebody is writing or telling a story, what is represented in that story? The message that they are trying to convey from a particular point of view, okay? It points out in this that we are not privy to a security camera view of the Old Testament. We have a narrative that presents a picture, a point of view that was trying to do. But in all of that, we may not always know the details that took place at a particular time. But what we can ascertain is the intent of the person that wrote that particular part. That's what makes the Old Testament and the Bible so beautiful, I think, is that how long this narrative took place over several thousand years, written by numerous authors, and they all, the composite, point and paint a very unique and a very a picture of where we are on things. Now, the fella that did the class, and if you open this up, there's a couple of illustrations there. Most of us are familiar with this. These are both pictures of a night sky. And if you don't have the printout, there's two aspects. One is a digital picture taken by the Hubble telescope. It's unique because, and it's filled with galaxies and stars. It's unique because when they did this, they were looking at a completely empty spot in space. They didn't think anything was there. And yet, as the telescope honed in and was exposed and could view for a greater depth, they realized that empty space was not empty, that it was vast, and it was filled with different objects. So that's a picture of the night sky. Is it the night sky? Who said no? Why, James?
It's a two-dimensional representation of a three to five-dimensional object.
It's not completely accurate, is it?
It doesn't show the relationships between the stars other than on a single plane.
So next door to that is a picture of a painting by the Dutch artist Van Gogh. Most of us have seen that picture. It's been printed and reprinted, and it's beautiful in color, not so much in black and white. Van Gogh, hopefully you're familiar with him, was a struggling artist all of his life for the most part. He suffered from different aspects, including epilepsy and severe depression and hallucinations, and you name it, and he's probably had it. Now, he painted this picture of starry nights in France in an asylum. He had a lot of freedom in the asylum, but he painted this basically from memory. There was nothing in his surroundings that would indicate that there was a small town or cedar trees or a chapel or anything that's depicted in this picture, and it's hard to see. But hopefully, have we all, are we all kind of somewhat familiar with that painting? It's a beautiful painting, one of the most famous ones. And that's also a depiction of the starry night, right? Just like the Hubble telescope has a picture of a starry night. Is that the night sky? James? No, it's not. Neither one of these are depictions of the night sky. And when we remember, and this is the point, when we read narratives in the Old Testament, we have to realize that we are receiving a perspective and the way that the author intended this to be. Now, we're leaving out a lot of details here, understand that, because we have talked about the inspiration of the whole Old Testament and how God used people and inspired people to write aspects that He wanted to present to us so that we would receive information. This is an aside, but it's kind of interesting. Joan brought me a paper, a magazine the other day. I like art. I'm not a connoisseur of art, but I do like art. And this was a magazine that she had saved from 2005, so almost 20 years ago. It was an artist by the name of Woody Long. Some of you may be familiar with some of Woody's work, but he was his story is really interesting. And I thought it was relative to what we are trying to say at this point. Woody and his family grew up around the Tampa area, and they basically, I think there were 9 kids. They picked strawberries. His daddy was kind of a scoundrel and abandoned him when he was about 14. And he had a way, apparently, with the truant officers, so Woody never went to school. He moved back up, eventually wound up in Andalusia. And he painted houses. And he never, at 14 years of age, they forced him to go to school. And he couldn't read or write at 14. He had never learned that because his father had always, got him off the hook and the family worked. So he kind of endured until he could leave school at 17 and started painting houses and stuff. Long story short, he became recognized for his artistic ability, and the reason that he did that, he went to a class that they were trying to teach, or at least talk about, abstract art. He could never really connect with that. And he said that within a matter of days, he came home and was thinking about it, and he says, I really can't read, I can't write, but he could create, through artistic expression, memories of his childhood. And he began to paint them. You can still buy his works. We'll come back to this later because, I've visited with Woody and his wife on several occasions. He's deceased now. But his paintings are all over the world, including major museums and, stuff that he painted. They still have his paintings. There are no prints. It's all original artwork that he did. But his expression and the way that he uses that medium expresses things that he could never be able to write. But that's an aspect of his memory which has been conveyed through artwork. We receive information in various ways. And we need to remember that. We need to remember that as we receive these writings and information from the Bible, that yes, it was from a perspective that we may never know all the details, but there's a message there. Sometimes I'm afraid, and please don't take me wrong, but sometimes I'm afraid that we get caught up in the apologetics aspect of things. So much so, in other words, where we're trying to prove the truthfulness of the Bible, that we often overlook the point of the Bible. And there's numerous things I think that we can use examples of. This is where I think we need to go back and remember the point. We need to remember that things can get lost, that we can spend so much time in trying to present the truthfulness of the Bible that we fail to deliver the purpose of the Bible. Jesus is a very compelling figure. Jesus does not need us to defend him. You know, there are people out there that, and folks that are deeply religious that get involved so much in defending the truthfulness of Jesus, his existence of Jesus, that we overlook the compelling nature in what he's wanting to point out. The Old Testament, in a lot of times, is exactly that same way. So we look at the narrative, the story, the telling of it, in a way that we just need to remember that. Do you understand the point that I'm trying to present and to make? I think a couple of weeks ago, Galloway Hilton filled in, and the first thing we kind of watched some of the video. The first thing he says is, "I'm not going to get in the weeds that we've been dealing with." Well, we're back in the weeds again, okay? But I think again that it's an important aspect for us to remember. Any questions on things? To emphasize this, on one of your pages, you'll see a picture of a French fellow that drew a picture of a pipe. I can't read French, but the inscription underneath that little picture of a pipe says, "This is not a pipe." For the same reason. He says that if he had said this is a pipe, it would have been a lie, because it's a picture of a pipe, it's a representation of a pipe, but it is not a pipe. We know a pipe when we see a pipe, and this is not. So we will continue on now. So when we start talking about narratives in the Hebrew Bible, we're talking about stories. And John, what did you say you taught? Literature? You taught literature. So you're a good person on this. What does a narrative story consist of? If we are going to write a story, what are the basic components of that story? That's pretty well sums it up. And if you couldn't hear her, she started out with a plot, the story that's trying to be conveyed, that usually in all cases there's a conflict that we have at some point, hopefully, a resolution to the conflict, and it usually involves some characters, doesn't it? Somewhere you got to have a character. This can take a lot of complex situations, from anywhere from the simple to the very, very complex. And if you've done a lot of reading of literature, you've run across some of these things too. So he gives the example of a very simple story with a plot. It involves Timmy or Tommy, one of the two, I can't remember. But Timmy grows up in his household. He's in a household. Timmy loves his family. He loves his dog. He loves his mom, and he loves his dad. And Timmy also likes and loves cookies. Okay? What kid didn't? I certainly did. He loves them so much that his mom becomes concerned about how many cookies Timmy is eating. So, what does mom do when she's concerned about that? Take the cookie jar and you do what with it? You put it up high on top of the refrigerator, where mom and dad can get to it, but Timmy can't. So Timmy is a smart little kid. So he figures out that if he will stay up late at night and take his flashlight, or in this case, his phone, and get under the covers and shine and read his comic books, eventually mom and dad are going to do what? Go to bed. So Timmy has stayed awake until mom and dad are at bed, and then he can sneak downstairs, pull the chair over to the cookie jar, and have all the cookies that he wants that night anyway. So what's the resolution of this story per Timmy? He's got all the cookies he wants, okay? What's, from a moralistic standpoint, as we imagine things, what's the problem with this? That Timmy has what? Learned at a very young age that if he's smart enough and sneaky enough and conniving enough, what can happen? He gets his own way and gets everything that he wants. See how a simple narrative story can have multiple implications on things. As Timmy grows up, if this is not changed or corrected in some ways, then he can continue to be a conniving, sneaky adult who is out to get all the money or cookies that he can possibly have. So what's another resolution to this narrative story? Well, mom can realize that she's come in, as Joan does when I'm eating almonds or something like that. She keeps a check on that. She doesn't say, but she does. And she knows that I've been eating too many almonds. You know, so what's the resolution with Timmy and eating too many cookies? She can take a different approach. You know, one of them, she can get the butter paddle like my mom used to have. And, you know, you can do some whacking with the butter paddle. Let me tell you. If you don't know what it is, I'll tell you. But if you continue to do that excessively, is that a good solution to the problem? No, because, you know, that usually a person's going to grow up thinking that if I take the butter paddle to somebody else, then that's going to resolve the problem. Mom can also go in and say, Timmy, I would like for you to be able to have cookies, but we have to have a limit to it. So we'll make a deal. For every time that you clean your room or take out the garbage or wash the dog or whatever Timmy's supposed to do, I'll give you a cookie. Okay? Another, you know, probably a more realistic result of the narrative story. So when we're talking about narratives in the Bible, and we're going to look at several examples of that, which I think are great, then you can look and see that these narratives, as with almost all stories or books that we tell or read, there are multiple layers of things, that there are multiple plots. The poetry and the narratives in the Bible are very similar in that they have different layers, that almost all of them, when we read them, that there are different messages that can be conveyed And hopefully it allows us to put ourselves in that position to understand the outcomes that can occur because of things that we have done. Is there anybody in here in some aspect have not been a Timmy or Tommy? I can think of many, many times that I have been in that same situation. And that's one of the main purposes that we find narrative stories, not so much that we can read a story, but that we can put ourselves in the position of the person in the story and realize that actions that we take can have an effect on how we become as adults, as Christians, as our children, and training them can occur. So there's a lot of purposes in that. That's when we look at the Old Testament and say, yes, it's instructions, it's an aspect for training, but it is also to put ourselves in that position and say, Caleb.
One of my favorite examples of that principle is in when David has sinned with Bathsheba, and you got a prophet Nathan who comes, and instead of just telling him, David, you've messed up big time here, he tells him the story. And the whole point of the story at the end, David makes a judgment on what should happen in this story, what the resolution should be. And then the twist is, he says, well, this story is about you. You are the man. And really, biblical narrative is designed to do that. It's designed to say, this is not just about these terrible Israelites who are falling away from God, how terrible they are. I would never do that. No, it's to get you to think about how this story is about you.
Exactly. And that's one of the main things that we want to talk about. We only have a few minutes, so I'm not going to take time to get into an example of a narrative story with exactly those kind of implications, but we're going to talk next week about Jonah. Most of us are very familiar with Jonah. From a children's standpoint, what's the narrative in Jonah? Got somebody that is told to do something, that fails to do something, suffers the repercussions of not doing something, and we have a resolution to the issue. You know the story. Storm comes up, Jonah's on the boat, gets thrown over, even though the people didn't want to throw him over, but they threw him over. Whale comes along, it's 3 days and 3 nights in the whale, utters a prayer to God, and the vomit on dry land. And then he does what he's told. But we're going to go into more detail on that next week, but we're not going to start that because I know you will have forgotten by next week what we're talking about. No. Are there any comments or questions that you have concerning biblical narrative? Again, I want to make sure that you understand the point that we're trying to talk about. Okay? And that point is we can read the Bible in the Old Testament all we want to and should, but as we read, understand that there's God's purpose behind what we read in the Old Testament, which relates to the New Testament and the story of Jesus. Okay. Anything else? Y'all can carry on a conversation now.